Welcome to Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is March 12th, 2014, and my guest is Stephen Teles, author and professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. Steve, welcome to Econ Talk.
Thanks for inviting me.
Our topic for today is a recent article you wrote for National Affairs titled Kludgeocracy in America. It's an indictment of a particular set of problems that we have with governance in America and our political system. What is kludge, and why do you consider America a kludgeocracy?
So a kludge is a term that comes from computer programming, and the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as an ill-assorted collection of parts assembled to fulfill a particular purpose, a clumsy but temporarily effective solution to a particular fault or problem. It's hard not to see that that definition as describing lots of what government today does. A lot of what government today does is an effort, in the absence of being able to get rid of a lot of stuff we've already got, to simply add new things on top of what we already have, and therefore try to make what we're doing now consistent with what we've done before. The Affordable Care Act, which I supported and still grudgingly support now, is a pretty good example of that, right? We had Medicaid and Medicare and employer healthcare plans and all that, and S-chip and all that other stuff. And then we added a bunch of new stuff on top of that in the Affordable Care Act, in part because it was so hard to tear up all the stuff that we already had, and making all those pieces somehow fit together is complex for government to do, right? A lot of what the problems we've had with the exchanges are the result of trying to create a system to deal with all of that complexity, and it's hard for citizens to cope with or understand, and in some cases makes it hard for them to know who to blame when they have problems that they seem like they can't understand, but they can't figure out what the source of it is or even who's responsible for it.
So what's the underlying cause of that phenomenon? So we understand why this happens in, say, the design of an operating system, a metaphor you used in your article, or at least we see it happening there. Why did this particular piece of kludge, the Affordable Care Act, why did it have to get layered on everything else? Why didn't we just say, well, look, this current system's a big mess, and let's start from scratch and have a better one? Right.
So in the article, I identify a bunch of different elements of the causes of kludgeocracy, many of which I think did play out in the Affordable Care Act. First of all is simply the structure of American institutions. American institutions, as we all learned when we were boys and girls, create separation of powers, and that separation of powers, a lot of the original theory behind that was that it would constrain government. It would keep government from acting because it would create all of these veto points, and in fact, it does, and we've actually multiplied veto points on top, right? Our committee system within each branch of Congress has some extra veto points because we've got multiple committees. And so you might think, well, that should all just make it harder to do stuff. But what it really does is, in the article I say, these operate less like veto points and more like toll booths, where the people who are at these particular veto points aren't actually interested in just stopping things, right? Usually what they're interested in is extracting a toll and saying, if you want to get past the toll, here's the price you have to pay, right? And the price you have to pay in many cases is leaving everything we've already got in place, because those toll takers are connected to interests who are invested in existing arrangements of government. And so the separation of powers designed to actually control the growth of government has also simultaneously made it hard to undo or redo aspects of government once they're already in place. Again, that's a kind of a paradox or an irony of our constitutional system, that it does operate to slow government on the way up, but it also arguably operates to slow government either on the way down or trying to simply change it laterally.
So let's make a distinction between, as you do in your article, between size and complexity. So liberals and conservatives, in the big picture political arguments that we have, whether it's at a presidential election or over a particular issue like healthcare, tend to argue about the things that get waved around are things like government's too big or government's not big enough or government should have a bigger role in this area. And your point is that it isn't so much that government's big or small, it's that it's complex and opaque. It's not transparent and it's not designed by anybody. It's emergent. So as a result, it doesn't necessarily lead to good policy in the area. It's just a complicated, messy policy. Is that accurate?
Yes. I think a couple of examples here are useful. I mean, the one that I think is most useful in making this distinction between thinking about policy in terms of big and small and thinking of it in terms of complex and simple is our retirement programs. So in essence, we have two parallel sets of retirement programs in the United States. Right? We have Social Security, which, whatever you think about it, is from the point of view of the user incredibly simple. Right? You work all your life, taxes get taken out, you retire, and checks start appearing in your mailbox. Right? From the point of view of that, right? You don't really need to know anything. You don't need to learn anything. You don't need to deal with a lot of complexity. That's simply how Social Security, at least the retirement part of Social Security, works. We also have a parallel system of IRAs, 401ks, all kinds of other complicated mechanisms for shielding savings from taxation that turn out to be very complex, very hard for individuals to understand. Anybody who's actually tried to look at their employer plan and try and sort through the dozens and dozens of mutual funds that they're presented with there will know what I'm talking about. And so we've got two separate parallel systems. The argument for Social Security is basically saying at whatever level of retirement savings we want to be guaranteed through government, that's a much more simple, transparent way to do it. And it's also, in some ways, much easier to hold responsible, right? We actually know exactly how much government spending on Social Security, whereas in the case of our parallel private retirement system, a lot of the costs are actually private, right? All of those people who feel like they have to hire financial advisors to tell them what their allocation and their account should be, all the people who are, busily reading magazines and other things, trying to get themselves up the learning curve about all these different mutual funds, which almost always turn out to give them worse results than simply an index fund would. That's all real costs in people's time and anxiety at a period in which we're already overwhelmed with the complexity of society in general. So again, I would distinguish those that complexity simplicity axis from the big versus small government axis.
Well, I hate to disagree with the creator of the concept, but I don't. That doesn't strike me as a particularly good example in the following sense. It's true that private investing is complicated, but that's because there are a lot of choices, and we can debate. It's an interesting debate about whether that's good or bad. I think it's good. Some people think it's bad. To me, the government part of it is fairly straightforward, right? We have the tax shielding of certain types of savings versus not other types, and the tax shielding of certain kind of investments and not other types. It seems to, and on the other hand, the Social Security system, I think, is quite complex and quite opaque. Most people don't know what they paid into it in their life. It's taken out automatically. It's true. It's simple to pay the money and receive the check, but the governance part of it is not simple at all. For a long time, I think still, maybe it's just flip-flopped recently, but for a long time, the money that you paid in through your payroll taxes didn't go toward anybody's retirement particularly. Some of it did, but most of it, or a lot of it, went to other things the government does. That's going to change if it hasn't. It will change soon if it hasn't already, because the system won't have enough money to pay for the retirement. It'll have to start tapping into direct taxation. So to me, and then how much you get paid is very complicated. It's a strange formula that most people don't know anything about. It's true. They just get the check. So I want to disagree with you, and I want to suggest take the example you gave in your paper, which is your essay, which is taxation. So taxation is unbelievably complicated. It does serve a whole bunch of special interests, and changing that is very, very hard for that reason. So to me, the retirement thing is there are intergenerational issues. There's issues about wealth versus poverty. There's implicit redistribution. But the real kludge is our tax system. Do you agree with that?
Well, I disagree with the retirement thing, and I'll go back around that with you one more time. I don't actually think if you were to survey most Social Security recipients that they find it complex or difficult to understand. Again, today we almost always get a report from the Social Security Administration that tells us how much we've actually paid in and what our monthly retirement will be. And again, there is a complicated formula that determines how you get from your monthly earnings to your Social Security payment. But that's actually invisible from the point of view of the recipient, right? That may be good or bad, but from the point of view of the recipient, it's perfectly
simple. I agree with that.
So again, I think that's the only, whereas the number of discrete decisions that individuals have to make over their lifetime trying to invest their 401k or IRAs generally overwhelm their decision-making capacity. I think that's, and require them to fall into depending on financial advisors who they, in many cases, also don't have the information to be able to effectively supervise either. So,
but that's not a problem with. But that's not a problem with gatekeeping or veto power, the separation of powers. That's a problem. That's a problem to the extent it's a problem with private choice. We could always make things simpler. We could we could change groceries to just have 4 things. Starch, protein, carbs, and fat, or sugar, and that would make shopping easier. But that's the issue that you're highlighting, which I think is very interesting, is the role that political incentives play for political actors in making things yucky.
Right. Well, I think the same point applies. There's lots of political interests that essentially want to increase this pool of mutual funds from, again, essentially unsophisticated investors who are also largely disaggregated, from which they can get large investment charges that are in fact larger than you would get in any much more aggregated system. And I do think that the same basic political economy applies, right? Once you actually have these things in place, interest groups are almost always better at playing defense than offense, right? Once you have those tax-sheltered savings in place, it's very hard to get to undo them, because you have to go through every one of those veto points all over again to undo what government's already doing. And I think the same principle applies to the tax system. Now, in fact, everything we're actually talking about here about retirement systems is in fact a feature of the tax system. Right. It's not a feature of some other, right. I mean, all these are about tax sheltered savings, which is part of the general complexity of government and the multiple different aspects of tax sheltered savings. So we don't just have one. We don't just have 401ks. We have IRAs. We have Roth IRAs. We have all these other ones that are designed for education. That is, we have even if you think we ought to shelter savings from taxation, we've done so in the most complicated and overlapping and difficult to understand way. That also people don't really understand how these multiple different tax sheltered savings systems actually interact, and to get the maximum benefit out of them, you generally have to pay for expensive tax advisors who tell you which of them you need to be using and how to maximize the benefit out of them.
I totally agree with that. Let's talk about the role of federalism. How does federalism lead to kludgeocracy?
So, federalism is a term under which many sins occur. That is, it's very easy to talk about federalism without being clear about what you mean by it. And the classic still, again, lots of us who took Intro to American Government will remember distinction between layer cake federalism and marble cake federalism. This used to be a better metaphor when people ate marble cake back when you and I were boys.
Yeah.
In a marble cake, right? Right. In a layer cake, you just have a straight, one layer cake on top of another, right? You think about it in terms of federalism, you can imagine a situation in which states had a clear set of functions that they were running, and the federal government had a clear set of functions they were running. So, for example, the federal government would be running healthcare programs, and it would fund it all and would run it all, and the states would be doing education, and they would fund it all, and they would run it all. That is one kind of federalism. That is not our federalism, right? The federalism that we've been living under for at least the last 80 years is one of pervasive interpenetration of layers of government, right? So think about Medicaid as the simplest one, right? The federal government pays about half of Medicaid more under the Affordable Care Act. But it doesn't administer Medicaid. The states administer Medicaid. But it sends lots and lots of rules down to the states about how they're going to run it. That, in fact, is the modal form of government for a huge amount of what government does. That's true of the environment, right? A lot of the actual implementation of environment is all at the state level, except with, pervasive government intervention. Education is, in some sense, an extreme example of this, right? Even though it's run state and locally, the level of rules that go along with federal money is extraordinary, and as lots of evidence shows, leads to a kind of compliance mentality because there are so many complicated rules that are being applied from the federal government down to the states that people are constantly worried they're going to get on the wrong side of it. So rather than thinking about being innovative or doing things new, every time people think about that, they're always worried that that's going to end up putting them on the wrong side of the line of some particular kind of government rule. So I think federalism ends up, but of course, once we have these what I call intergovernmental kludges, they're very hard to undo. And the tendency is to keep doing more of them, right? So the Affordable Care Act, in fact, took what was already an intergovernmental kludge of Medicaid, and because that's what government had already been doing, that's what government had already been attempting in extending health insurance, the path of least resistance was to do more of it, right? And to expand Medicaid and to do all the exchanges through the states because the federal government didn't have the capacity or administrative kind of capacity. That was all in the states, right? So once you start doing intergovernmental kludges, the path of least resistance in any case is to keep doing more of it.
Yeah, the puzzle for me with the Affordable Care Act is why we didn't just expand Medicaid, which we already had in place for people who couldn't afford health care or health insurance. Actually, I don't care about health insurance. It bothers me that we keep talking about health insurance. We really care about health care. Right. So we have a government system that already helps poor people. And why didn't we're off subject here a little bit, but why do you think we did?
In fact, the biggest part, of the Affordable Care Act was not the exchanges. It was the massive expansion of Medicaid. Now, of course, again, this is another element of complexity because of our in part, the complexity that was introduced by the Supreme Court here. The Affordable Care Act expansion of Medicaid had to be voluntary for states. So the states that arguably needed, had the greatest need for an expansion of health insurance, like Texas, basically turned down the expansion. But it was a huge expansion, and I think that was where the largest percentage of increase in health insurance coverage actually came from, out of the Affordable Care Act. Everybody was talking about the exchanges because that was the sexier part and it had the mandate, and that's what everybody was focusing on. But that was not where the real kind of raw power of increasing health insurance coverage came from.
But mentioning the exchanges reminds me of another aspect of the problem that you mentioned, which is the role that the federal government plays in, I would say, corrupting or running private enterprises while keeping the illusion that they're private. So we have private insurance companies, which they're already not so private. There's a huge amount of regulation that decides what they can insure, what they have to insure, what they can charge, whether they can operate across state lines, the cost of doing so, et cetera. And now we've gone and said, okay, you can't offer certain types of – the federal government said you can't offer certain kinds of plans. Well, you can for a while, maybe. And, there's a point where the profitability of these enterprises, how they're run, the losses are all tend to be socialized. We've seen this in other areas. We see it with the banks. The banks in the United States are called private, but in many ways they're highly regulated, and they're favored and punished and everything else by the federal government in ad hoc and sometimes legislative ways, but mainly ad hoc ways, which to me is very destructive of the rule of law. So talk about that issue about contractors and private firms versus public provision.
Right. So again, this is, I think the entire story I'm telling here is in part a story of ironies, a story of people trying to do one thing and getting, in some ways, the opposite. So we can think about the ways that conservatives have attempted to control government. One of them was privatization. Now, of course, there's multiple ways you can do things that are called privatization, right? When the British privatized, many of the, at least some of the privatized industries, basically what they did is they said, this airline company was, British Airways was a public company, and now it's just like every other private company, right? It's going to be regulated just like every other private company. But lots of privatizations, most privatizations arguably were not like that, right? There still was an expectation that that these firms had a social function after privatization. So the social function remained, but the control of ownership shifted, right? What you get out of that equation is regulation, often pervasive regulation, because you're still trying to perform some function that people think of as public through a private entity. Now, the tendency in all those cases is to get exactly what you're describing, right? To get a kind of faux private sector. And so we see that in military contracting, right? Military contractors, most of them have a single, or at least primary buyer of their services, and that's the federal government, the Pentagon. Some of the largest consulting firms, especially around here in the Washington area, their primary, or in some cases almost exclusive, purchaser of services is government. And I think some of that's come from the fact that conservatives thought, if we actually, even if we're going to perform this function is going to be considered to be social, if we can push it out into the private sector, then that private sector will become a lobby for further privatization. But in many cases, those private contractors become a lobby for the continuing socialization of the function, so long as they're the ones who actually end up getting the benefits, right? And you can multiply these things through multiple different areas. And I think that's one point where, just like I was suggesting that one way to solve the intergovernmental kludge problem is to create rules that force us to make decisions about whether this should be federal or state, as opposed to constantly trying to split the difference. In many cases between public and private, we need rules that help us do that, right? Either something's going to be straight up government function, where it's clearly funded through taxation, and then the money goes out through spending, or it's going to be straight up private and owned, and firms are going to be able to go in and out of business. But it's whenever you end up getting this middle ground that you often get what you describe as corruption, problems of rule of law. You get kind of corporatist arrangements, and all of those are very problematic, but in a way they're a result of us trying to split a bunch of differences, right? Trying to get, public action, but with private actors. And that, which is a project that has gone on for a long time, right? We all remember reading, Charlie Schultz's little book, The Public Use of Private Interest. And then later on, David Osborne's books on, talking about how government should be doing steering rather than rowing. I think arguably there's a good case that if government's going to do something, it ought to steer and row. And if it's not willing to steer and row, it ought to leave it to the private sector.
Well, an interesting example of that would be education, where it's not at the federal level, but at the local level, right? It's bizarre to some extent, and we don't just take it for granted. But it's a little bit bizarre that government doesn't just fund education; it also provides it. It steers and rows, right? Doesn't do such a good job. I personally would like to see it stop rowing, stop. I don't know what the right metaphor is. I don't know.
Well, rowing is So steering would be the kind of micro regulation.
Yeah, I'd like them to do neither. I wouldn't mind if they funded the team and then say, "Good luck. I hope you win the race." But
and I think look, in the article I basically say, there's a good argument for a national voucher. Say, there's no real good argument for having arguably the states or localities involved in education at all, right? That is, there's no good argument for having property tax funded things for this. We ought to have straight up vouchers funded through income tax, and then people would get to choose in a market of private providers. That would be a pretty simple way to deal with these things, and there'll be also a simple way to deal with all of the distributive problems we have of having thousands of different taxing jurisdictions that are funding education. But instead we've been trying to do it through complicated mechanisms like all these different funds that the Department of Education distributes to the states, all these complicated adequacy lawsuits that keep going through all these state courts. They're all basically an effort to solve a distributive problem where there is actually a fairly simple straight up mechanism, which would be to move to a system like national vouchers, which again I would support. I'm not sure if you would support, Russ. Would you?
Well, I'd prefer it to the current system, but I think it's always an issue of what's better versus worse. And I think what's fascinating about your article, what made me think about lots of applications, is there's so many problems where the government says, look, some politician says, this isn't working well, so I'm going to propose this solution. And so often I look at it and I say, well, the reason it's not working well is because you did this thing before. Why don't we get rid of that thing? And the answer is because that thing benefits some people and nobody wants to change that. So we do layer this stuff on top of it. I recently tweeted that the Common Core, which is an idea that there should be common things that people learn in school, is a horrible idea, in my opinion. There's no reason the federal government should be deciding what should be in the Common Core. But maybe it's not a bad idea given that so many schools are not responsive to their students and the parents and don't teach very much. And maybe there's this is an end around to the fact that the current system doesn't respond very well to students and parents. But why wouldn't we fix that problem? Why are we always trying to solve something that's already, it's like another one would be the high cost of medical care. Well, we're pretty confident. I'm pretty confident why the medical care is so expensive and why healthcare insurance is expensive. We know a lot of reasons. It's things like mandated things that insurance has to cover, and it's the underlying cost. The underlying cost tends to come from the fact that people pay with other people's money, and when you do that, people want to buy more than they otherwise would. But we like those features of it, so we leave those in place, and we try to find a way, an end around, to solve the problem that usually causes a new set of problems we've got to fix. So that's go ahead.
Right. And the one thing I would actually say on that, again, if you're trying to figure out why is it that there's a durable bias against undoing stuff we're already doing, right, and creating space to do something new, or to simply solve the problem by getting rid of the thing we're already doing. Again, I think the veto points thing helps with that. But the other thing is we know about interest groups, especially in a system with as pervasive an interest groups as we have, is interest groups usually form not in anticipation of government action, but in response to government action, right? That is, the elderly were not really organized before Social Security. They got organized as a consequence of Social Security.
I agree.
And so when you actually look at the universe of interest groups we have, the universe of interest groups we have is essentially the mobilized force of those who've already got what they want out of government, right? They want a little bit extra, or they want to, push it up a little bit here or there. But the most of what they're there for is to protect what they've already got. And therefore that also creates a durable bias against undoing things, because the people who might want something new are generally likely to be relatively unmobilized, whereas the people who more or less like what we're already doing are much more likely to be mobilized, right? So all the people who might benefit from a big national voucher system are likely to be unorganized, in fact, are unorganized. And all the people who are benefiting from the complicated set of federal grants that go to school jurisdictions, right, the ones whose job is related to sorting through all of them and unpackaging them for localities, right, they all know exactly what their interest is in government, and they're all organized here, a lot of them in, DuPont Circle. The same thing is true of the student loan system, right? There's lots of easier ways to deal with that than the complicated system of tax-sheltered savings and other kinds of things we have, right? You could just straight up increase the Pell Grant system and get rid of everything else we've got. But we have a whole system here in one DuPont Circle, which is 2 blocks from where I'm sitting, from all the people who both understand our existing complicated system of higher education financing and their living depends on that existing system. So again, our political system has a bias toward what's already being done. That's both in terms of mobilization and in terms of our arrangement of institutions. And if you want to do something about it, you have to somehow either change that bias of mobilization or change the bias of institutional arrangement.
So let's talk cross-country for a minute. When I get depressed about crony capitalism or, say, some particular aspect of it, let's take agricultural price supports or the sugar quotas, which benefit a handful of families in America, make them really rich and make me really poor. But that doesn't make me really poor. It just means I pay a slightly higher price for things with sugar. And as you point out, those of us who pay a slightly higher price for sugar aren't really well organized and never will be. The effects are small. They're dispersed, as Mansur Olson understood, that this is going to make it likely that sugar quotas persist. But I look at that and I say, well, it's a small thing. It's not a big thing compared to, say, I don't know, Argentina, where if you're a friend of the ruling family, you might get a monopoly, et cetera. But then I started to think maybe the glass is half empty here in the United States too. The paper today has a story that New Jersey is not going to allow Tesla, the auto company, to sell cars directly to consumers because the dealers in the state don't like it. They make a lot of money. They give a lot of money to politicians. The auto dealers they're gonna block that everywhere, and so consumers are going to be punished with fewer choices. When I look across, and then I say, well, sugar's small, but help bailing out the banks, that was big. That distorted our capital system. Forget the transfer of money. The distortion of investment decisions, capital allocations, kind of horrifying. Having a lousy school system, kind of horrifying, not so good for the next generation and reduces, I think, economic mobility and so on. So why is it that our system has so many of these phenomena, so many things that benefit small groups then get locked into place and then the status quo persists compared to other countries or do they all have it? I mean, we're supposed to be a democracy. Well, is it just that, well, it's a democracy that works pretty well? And last point, as a classical liberal, I like to believe that the Constitution used to protect us from this. The Constitution isn't really in play anymore, except for a handful of certain kinds of rights, not for economic stuff. So we're just it's a free form game, and the people who can bite into the system and take a slice for themselves, we'll keep doing it.
Right. So let me. That was about 3 questions. So let me see how I can sort through them. One, so the cross-national story, I think, is a little complicated. My colleague, Adam Scheingate, wrote his first book, was called The Rise of the Agricultural Welfare State, and it's a comparison of agriculture in the United States, Japan, and France. And so one of the things he says is, so it is a little depressing to look at, things like sugar subsidies and that thing. But if you want to see really depressing, look at France or Japan. Like look at corporatist systems. Rice. Right? Corporatist systems.
Price of rice in Japan, 10 times the world price. Yeah.
Right. So, and so the reason for that, right, is that, again, I remember when I was a boy, when I was in college, I was a journalist and I was covering, I got a great job where I got to cover all these obscure parts of the federal government. And I'd go into the Department of Agriculture, and it was just like, it seemed like a wholly owned subsidiary of, a bunch of farmers, right? That's nowhere near what it is in France and Japan, right? Where literally the farmers basically own the government. And so, if you look at the United States, we did actually get the Freedom to Farm Act back in the 90s. And that was problematic. It wasn't perfect, right? But France and Japan have never gotten anything with that much deregulation. And there actually was a pretty fair amount of deregulation in the Freedom to Farm Act, right? The clawing away of the subsidies didn't really last, right? But the deregulation of what we do in farming actually did. And I think one of the lessons for that is that our system is all gummed up with interest groups and with disproportional mobilization. But all of those veto points that I mentioned that stop action from occurring are also entry points, right? They're places where you can start getting something going. You can start, you don't have to get everybody to already agree to get things moving, right? You can get a hearing going in Congress, right, to start trying to get people sensitized to the issue, right? There's lots of that kind of stuff that does introduce a kind of element of dynamism into our system. And so if you, one of the books that I think, especially people who are interested in these things need to read is Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones's book, Agendas and Instability in American Politics. And one of the things they say is the pattern of American governance is one where you get long periods of stability, which are consistent with the kind of iron triangle story that we all learned when we were kids. But then sudden wrenching changes where suddenly interest groups that seemed indestructible suddenly are put on the back foot. And I think that's partially because of the dynamism of our institutional system, right? The same thing that locks things down and keeps changes from happening helps you, in many cases, attack special interests. The real problem, right, is our political system has limited parallel processing capacity, right? There's only so many things that it can handle in attacking existing interest group arrangements at any one time. So I actually do think that in some ways, ideas do have some relevance, probably more than a standard public choice account would make you think, right? That a lot of these special interest arrangements are actually vulnerable to exposure, but there's only so much capacity our political system has at any one time to expose the fact that, the sugar subsidy has all these perverse distributive consequences and simply, enriches a small group of people. The political system has space for about one of those kind of focusing events at any one time. But has a hard time doing all of them at once.
Yeah, but it's not just the political system; it's also our brains and our media. And I've often wondered, the Washington Post might write an expose on the sugar issue. I'm sure they have. Every once in a while, there's an article about some similar thing, right? Some embarrassment. That's the daily fare of a good investigative newspaper, right? So they run that article, and you might read it as a citizen, and you might get a little bit outraged and upset, and then you got other things on your mind, and eventually it slips below the surface again. What would happen if every day, the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, harped on one of these issues, right? Would it make a difference? You think it would. There would be some shame eventually.
Well, this one, again, one of the things, if you look at and I really do recommend your listeners read Baumgartner and Jones' book, one thing they show is these moments when you get sudden disruptions in the political agenda are characterized by things where you get, story after story after story that's going out, that's having the features you're talking about, right? So again, if you go back and look at what ended up crushing nuclear power in the 70s, right? Yeah. It was that you got these scandals, right, that people kept writing story after story about problems of nuclear safety and flaws of the regulatory system, right? This was not like a one-day story. This was something that dominated the media agenda, that then members of Congress felt like, they were constantly worried that they were going to get caught on the wrong side of this issue. Again, even if you go back and look at tax reform in the mid-'80s, there's arguably a story like this, right? That there were constant stories about how, GE wasn't paying any taxes, or all these big companies weren't paying any taxes, right? You could keep writing story after story the wealthy company not paying any taxes kind of feature, right? So the thing I think that really distinguishes those moments when you really get the capacity for major destructive force are when those things become more than just a single day story, but they become a full-on scandal and sort of media feeding frenzy. And again, you do see these things. These things do happen, and I think they are a regular feature of our political system, but they depend upon ideas, right? Somebody has to be able to take that particular scandal and put it into a larger framework so people think, that this isn't just about some individual, right, but this is about a structural problem with our agricultural system or our nuclear power system. There has to be a policy entrepreneur there who's willing to kind of ride this thing and coordinate that kind of scandal. And there have to be government officials, right, who are sort of waiting to be able to do something, and then this is their moment. And I think that's what characterizes the periods in which you actually do get some capacity for government to destroy things it's already doing as opposed to just layering things on top. The real danger in a lot of these cases, and there's a great book that I really recommend by Eric Potashnick called Reforms at Risk. And essentially what it does is it says, we had all these books, at least in political science, that in the 80s that were about, Mansur Olson had told us that government just basically serves the organized and screws the diffuse interests, right? But we'd had all these things government did in the 70s that didn't seem to be characterized like that, right? You think about trucking deregulation or airline deregulation.
That's
a bunch
right.
of those, a bunch of those areas, right? Government actually did something very negative to a concentrated interest. Now, the problem is, right, that happens because you get these feeding frenzies, because suddenly everybody's talking about how wealthy the airline industry, executives are getting off of a monopoly industry structure, and how much this is driving up prices for consumers. And so you get this brief moment where everybody's focused on that, and they exist, and the incumbents are disadvantaged. The question is what happens after that, right? And so in the case of tax reform, we actually did radically simplify the tax code in 1986 because there was this brief moment where everybody was focused on that. And everybody was, in the public, or people, at least members of Congress, were worried that they might actually be held responsible if they voted against a tax simplification, right? But once you did it, then everybody moved on to the next thing. Everybody moved on to focusing on something else, and it was easy for all the interests that had lost before to come back and claw back, come back out of the woodwork, right?
Yeah.
Just give one other example. The counterexample that Potashnick gives is airline deregulation, right? So airline deregulation worked in part because it literally destroyed the strongest supporters of airline regulation, right? Look at the first people who went to the wall and got bankrupted by airline deregulation, right? It was airlines like Eastern Airlines that had the worst cost structure, right? Which is why they wanted regulation in the first place. So if you can actually get these simplifying mechanisms that actually destroy the people who were advocates for the previous kind of corporatist arrangement, then you've got some capacity to actually make that stick and keep a relatively simple, streamlined kind of system in place. Yeah,
that's fascinating. That the downside or the pessimistic story about that is, to me, is Dodd-Frank. Here you had this incredible, what should have been an incredible watershed moment, the abuse of the fiscal system by the banks, and somehow a regulatory thing was put in place that doesn't seem to have solved any of the underlying problems. I partly blame my profession for that. Its willingness to say that all these things were necessary and not require more evidence from people who said they had to be done, these bailouts, and they couldn't have been done a different way. But I find that to be remarkable, although I have a little bit of hope that the next time it happens, maybe politically it will be difficult to do what they did before. I guess we'll see. Now, a lot of our discussion so far could lead a listener to think that we're talking about what's sometimes called, I think, the ratchet effect, that things get put in place, they're hard to get rid of, and so as Some people have argued that, well, that's why government keeps getting bigger. There's not much of an ability to make it smaller. But you argue that both liberals and conservatives should dislike Kludge. Explain why that's the case.
So so I guess there on the one side, on the liberal side, one problem with kludgy policies is that citizens don't often recognize that government is in fact doing anything for them, right? So again, we have this feature of public opinion that shows that there are a lot of people who in fact are pervasive recipients of government assistance who believe the government is actually only helping poor and black people, right? I think that's a pretty common feature of public opinion. Now, part of that is because the actual hand of government, right, in there helping them pay their mortgage, helping them send their kid to college, et cetera, right? These are all things that people experience, especially in the middle class, often experience as private because the hand of government is hidden, even though it's there through subsidy, through regulation, through market structure, and through everything else. And so part of my argument is liberals would be better with simpler, more straightforward, more visible forms of government because it would make clear to citizens, right, the degree to which their social welfare is dependent upon some kind of muscular role for government. On the other hand, I think where conservatives are concerned, it becomes hard actually for people who want to get government out of particular areas. When government's sort of everywhere and nowhere, it's hard to. It's like trying to stab jello to the wall, right? You just can't do it. You can't get the thing. Your target's just too hard to grab a hold of when government is all over the tax code. It's all penetrating through
the health system,
our system of private litigation and everything else.
I love when people say, well, we know private healthcare is a bad idea. Look how expensive it is in the United States.
Right.
We could try it. Maybe we'd see how expensive it is, but don't call what we have now a private system.
Right. And so I think the other thing, of course, is that we end up having lots of, in some ways it's actually very hard to say that you're a supporter of private enterprise when so much of private enterprise is, in fact, are basically, as you sort of described it before, are basically, public utilities, or have been rendered into public utilities. I think in a way it would be a lot better if we had a governmental system in which some things were just big, dumb, stupid things where government was just moving money around or doing relatively simple tasks that only it can do, and then left the private sector on its own. That would be a much easier private sector to defend than the kind of private sector we have today. So again, I think the other thing is, I think arguably that Kludgeocracy is a lot more expensive, right? That big, complicated, multi-layered systems, right, are in fact forms of taxation. Now, they don't go directly through the federal government budget, but they all end up imposing costs on private actors. They make goods more expensive. Those are all basically forms of extraction, but they're hidden forms of extraction that are hard to mobilize against. And so what I basically say in the article is that, ironically, by pushing down on the capacity of government to do things transparently through taxing and spending, we haven't gotten rid of the demand for government. We simply constrained one form of its supply. And so, like a down pillow, you push it down in one place, the feathers all push up somewhere else. And I think that's essentially what's happened with some of conservative and libertarians' efforts to control government, is by pushing down as effectively as they have on taxing and spending, everything's come up through private litigation, mandates, regulation, and all these other devices. Again, I think, you can look at some evidence like that, like, the fact that we've been pushing as hard, conservatives and libertarians have pushed as hard as they had against carbon taxation hasn't reduced people's desire to do something about global warming. But we're seeing it through all these incredibly complicated subsidies for electric car makers and attempts to put regulations on what kind of light bulbs people can use, right? We ought to actually think about loosening up on the one form of government that we actually know best how to measure and control, which is taxing and spending, while putting more constraints on these other forms of government that we haven't actually figured out how to control or even understand. end.
Another example would be the minimum wage, which is economists debate whether it reduces jobs or not, which I find shocking, but it's a fact. We don't agree. And the alternatives are things like increasing the earned income tax credit or paying some kind of wage subsidy, but those come out of budget, so it's much more attractive for politicians to just mandate that the private sector pay more. And it's a tax.
Right.
It's a hidden tax. To me, most of the tax falls on people who lose their jobs or won't find jobs or won't get training because of this tax. But it's clearly even if you think government should do something to help low-wage people, this is not one of the best ways to do it.
Right. And again, I think this is one of the ironies that the piece tries to put out is that, the only form of government that we actually know, again, literally down to the penny, we know exactly how much government is spending, right? We know exactly how much it's taxing, right? That's all in the federal budget. You can take a look at it. You think about the system of private litigation, right? We have, the estimates people have of how much, is being distributed through private litigation. Just think about, disability, right? In the Americans Disability Act. People have incredibly wide ranges of sense of how much we're actually spending through the Americans with Disabilities Act. People have almost no sense of what the actual distributive effects are, right? Who's actually benefiting from that form of regulation. And that's true of most of the places where we've tried to deal with some social problem through litigation as opposed to through other mechanisms. The same thing is true of regulation, and of which the minimum wage is one, right? We know exactly how much, the earned income tax credit is costing us, but the estimates of who's actually paying the minimum wage and where, and what the incidence of it is, those are all pretty complicated and therefore hard to actually get people to focus on.
Yeah, and it's really hard to tell somebody you don't have a job because of this, because you can't show it. It's not necessarily true. And so the people who would normally be against it don't realize that it's affecting them necessarily.
Right.
While we're talking, I just kept thinking about the Affordable Care Act again. I apologize for coming back to it, but it is remarkable how many people supported it when they didn't know what was going to happen. And they just said, well, we'll figure it out. We'll work it out. It's not going so well. And yet you and others, I don't see anybody saying it was a mistake. And part of that, I think, is some of it's obviously reputation. It's hard for people to admit they made a mistake. But I think the other issue is there is an awareness that there isn't an easy replacement. So, yeah, it's not great, but it's better than nothing, I think, is a common attitude. Do you think is that fair? Does that capture your view?
That would probably actually be a pretty good summary of my attitude.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Was that so I think, so one of the things is that we do know that the major expansions of social insurance and healthcare were in moments when one of the parties happened to get, an extraordinary majority in the Senate. So I think part of my attitude was, if we're ever going to get close to universal coverage, and I know you've got issues with that, and should we think about health insurance or not, and that's fine. But my attitude was, if we're going to do it, this is about the only time we're going to be able to do it. Right. Now, again, you can have some questions about whether we should try to do it or not, but that was my guess. Now, again, I would have rather have done it in a different way, but some very smart people thought that this was like the only way that you could get through the through the eye of the needle. Now, part of the point I make in the article is that, in fact, actually, I think there's a good argument that the House's version of healthcare was simpler than the Senate's. Now, again, a lot of people would have had disagreements about it, but the Senate's ended up being a lot more complicated, in part because of the feature of the filibuster, right? One thing, going back to my model of veto points, right? One thing the filibuster does, again, it doesn't just stop action, right? It means now you've got 10 extra people, all of whom have to get paid off or bought off in order to get past the toll. And I think that's what happened in healthcare, right? You had 10 extra, basically, Democratic senators who all, and obviously, the Cornhusker kickback that, happened in Nebraska was one example of that, right? Somebody saying, I'll let you get past the toll, but you got to pay a big cost for this, right? And lots of the things that really would have destroyed existing interests in healthcare were exactly what that last 10, those marginal 10 senators all wanted people not to touch, right? And so I think there's a good argument that it was really hard to do, anything that was going to, tear up anything from the, from the roots. And I think, that's true for, Republicans if they were trying to do tax reform, right? If you look at what Dave Camp proposed, right, you try and get that through the Senate, and you're going to find that even if Republicans had a filibuster-proof majority, right, those last 10 Republican senators would often be the ones who would be most likely to want to protect the interests that somebody like Dave Camp was trying to undo. So I do think that one thing we have to do in order to really get at this phenomenon of government complexity is to get rid of some of these mechanisms that were designed to keep government from acting, but now basically have the function of making it hard to undo what we've already got in place.
Yeah, we got about 5 minutes left. Let's close on that, because one of the things I learned from your article is the possibility that some of these features that I've always thought were features are actually bugs, and I think that's a really, really interesting insight. So my first thought is, I like filibustering. That's fabulous. It slows things down. I like gridlock. As a small government guy, I like things that make it hard for government to get stuff done. Your point is that, so when government does get stuff done, there are lots of people who get paid off. So do you think was it culture? Was it social norms in the past that kept people from exploiting these veto points? What happened in the post-World War II era that made government grow so dramatically in the United States and that allowed this kludge to happen, right? We have obviously there's different periods of American history where government's relatively small, but starting around you could say 45, you could say it's an aftermath of World War II, you could argue it starts with the Great Society. Somewhere along there, people didn't have any hesitation about collecting those tolls at those toll booths. That seems to me to be a big part of the problem, if you're on my side. If you're not on my side, maybe think it's a plus. But I think you make the point pretty persuasively that even for people who like bigger government, it's the wrong way to do it. Do you have any thoughts on why these toll collectors have suddenly been more aggressive?
So again, I think the argument I would make that I think is especially of interest for people of a libertarian mindset, who generally tend to be the most supportive of what they think of as the original constitutional design, is that that constitutional design is probably very good for a people who have a relatively modest expectation for what the federal government's going to do. But once you actually get a mature set of government functions, right, and I think the question of how did we end up expanding government so much, in that period is probably beyond my ability to explain.
I gave you you got at least 4 minutes left.
So, but I think the important point is that once you actually get that shift in public expectations, our constitutional system starts working in a way the opposite of the way that libertarians would want, right? Once you've already, any government system is going to develop a fair amount of new functions, and a desirable one is going to be destroying stuff we've already done at the same time as it's adding new things, right? That there's going to be both destruction and creation simultaneously. And our system is wired up for creation and not very good at destruction, and that's why you get kludge, right? And I think part of it is, again, if you think about lots of the things, when there were moments when government action was going to occur, how did it happen? Well, in lots of these cases, as I use in the case of intergovernmental kludges, right? In the period in the 50s and 60s, actually even going back to the 30s, a lot of the expansion of the social welfare state had to happen through the states, through funding state governments, rather than being done straight up centrally, right? And that's because at that time, Southern senators controlled Congress, and they said, okay, you can have your bigger government, but you're going to have to cut, you're going to have to make sure South Carolina runs it so that we can make sure that black people don't get welfare payments, right? Just to be really blunt about it, right? And the same thing was true of urban political machines. Urban political machines were in places like Chicago and New York City. Said, oh, okay, you can get your bigger government, right? But you got to cut us in on the action. And I think that's a feature of our federalism and separation of powers that meant at this moment in which government was expanding, it expanded in all these complicated ways. And the other point I make in the article is the kind of myth of the private market caused us to try to find ways to, when we were going to expand government, when there was public demand for that, to do it in ways that seemingly cut private actors in on the action rather than having government do it fairly straightforwardly itself. And so I think that the plea I would make to libertarians and conservatives is that they need to really rethink how the institutional features that they associate with our Constitution function once you have a mature government. And the challenge is really, how do you undo what that government's already doing? All those mechanisms like separation of powers and the filibuster may work the opposite of the way that they generally think they do.
And what would be your plea to liberals?
My plea to liberals, I think, would be to be willing to, go big or go home. That is to say that, we're going to stop kind of negotiating with ourselves and trying to figure out ways to do government by cutting, private interest in on the action. I think that was a lot of what happened with the Affordable Care Act. We should have been willing to say straight up that we just want, we want Medicare for all. Medicare is complicated and it's problematic, right? But it's not nearly as complicated as what we ended up with. And that one way or another, we're going to end up getting blamed when the complexity of these things ends up making us look bad, like it is with the exchanges, and that we ought to be willing to, in a way, go out and straightforwardly say to the public, here's what we want. Here's the social justice justification for it. And maybe we'll lose.
Here's the cost.
Right? Yeah. Well, maybe we'll lose, and that either we can make that claim to the public in a transparent, direct way, or we should just accept that we're not going to win and we're going to wait and fight another day.
My guest today has been Stephen Teles. Steve, thanks for being part of Econ Talk.
Thanks a lot, Russ.
This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.